thanks for being here, but we still wait for the official starting time because there might be people joining us from the stream online, so that's why it takes till 10 minutes to read something or enjoy yourself.
We can start doing a pub quiz or something, you know. do something fun. Fergus is going to start a Mexican wave.
We're allowed to start. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining our session on newsroom innovation in the new normal. And as you can see, it's a bit a strange normal because we're all spaced out here in this room. I'm Ezra Eeman. I'm the change director editorial at Mediahuis, a media group active in Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, and Germany. And I'm mainly tasked with looking how we prepare our newsrooms for the future and supporting that transition with both technology and knowledge. And I'll be the modest moderator of this panel, and I'm joined with a brilliant panel here. Next to me we have Justyna Kurczabinska. Sorry. Senior Manager of News Strategy and Development at the European Broadcasting Union. And she's leading and shaping quite some exciting new news projects together with public broadcasters across Europe. And before that, she was head of the Eurovision News Exchange. And next to her, we have Fergus Bell, founder and CEO of Fathm, an independent news lab, agency and consultancy based in the UK that supports newsrooms bringing their ideas to reality. He's passionate about the future of journalism and fighting the threat of misinformation. And Fergus is also a board member of the Online News Association. And then finally, we have Jane Barrett, global editor media news strategy at Reuters. And before that, global head of multimedia at Reuters. She led the digital transformation of the Reuters newsroom and works across global teams of almost everything, product, marketing, business development, and she's also a board member at the World Editor Forum. So to give you a bit of context on the panel, the idea is to really have an open conversation about newsroom innovation and what that means in the new post-pandemic normal. And the word newsroom is deliberately placed in that title there because we want to talk about innovation in and with the newsroom, rather than innovation that happens somewhere outside and somewhere else in the organization. And the starting point is, I think, the realization that we have seen a tremendous acceleration of new ways of working, experimentation, as well as innovation these last 2 years. Much of that was very pragmatic and tactical. Suddenly, the old workflows and the ways of working didn't apply anymore, and we had to kind of overnight, newsrooms needed to shift to new ways of working and to new realities. But it also fueled new formats, new products, new collaborations. And so I'm very interested to hear a bit more about that from the panel, how they approached innovation during that period, but also what of that can we learn to the future. How will innovation change in that post-pandemic landscape? What are the conditions that we need for innovation? How do we fund it? How do we collaborate in the future? So that are some of the questions that we will tackle in the conversation. But I'll start with a simple question to all of you. How do you define innovation in your organization? And how does that manifest itself concretely? And I might start with Jane. Just what does it mean for you?
So I tend to see innovation kind of in three main buckets. And so the first bucket is really is our newsroom going to start to do something that actually already exists out in the wild? So, for example, we've seen over these last few years lots of media organizations getting into newsletter strategies or audio strategies, TikTok strategies now. So it's something that's out there already, but you're trying to work out how to bring that new thing into your newsroom. The second main bucket I look at is really changing what we do and how we do it. So really, I mean, this was the big bucket for the pandemic. Everyone became an innovator during the pandemic. We suddenly had to very much change how we were working and what we were doing, how we were delivering news. And we can get into some of the examples of this later. So the first one, sort of, bringing something in that already exists. Second one, changing what we do and how we do it. And then the third one is inventing something completely new. And I don't know if people in this room have the joy of knowing Nidal Salah El-Din, who's now at Axel Springer, but she calls these the glitter ponies. And they're the sort of the new bright and shiny thing that comes in, and everyone goes, "Oh, exciting." And into that bucket I would put, for example, artificial intelligence. How are we going to use AI in news? It will come our way, absolutely, and we're absolutely right to be thinking about it. But what tends to happen with the glitter ponies, or the totally new things, is that they get a lot of attention, they get a lot of management attention. PR gets very excited about talking about them. But actually, they're the very, very hard lifts, and they're very often the sort of the longer term lifts. And so I would say that we absolutely need to be doing those, but not at the expense of paying attention to those first two buckets as well. So that's how I tend to frame innovation.
And very concretely, certainly in that first bucket, what does it mean at Reuters?
Yeah, so at Reuters, of course, we are a big agency. The vast majority of our clients are B2B clients, but we do have a B2C area, or a B2P, because we do call them professionals rather than consumers. And so there's a lot of stuff that we're doing in that area. So, for example, with newsletters, we just rolled out this last week. Those of you who are active on LinkedIn might have seen, but we've just rolled out a new autos newsletter. We are playing around with some different new forms of audio, and also maybe a little bit older, but we can get into this, but so 2 years old now, moving into events. Oh. So kind of new business lines, new products that we didn't have before, but were actually out there already, but we've now adopted and we're doing them the Reuters way.
Thanks. Fergus, do you kind of recognize those three buckets? Because I guess you work together with companies, media companies, and you need a common understanding of what innovation means if you want to work with them?
Yeah, so my buckets are aligned but slightly different, because I'm a little bit different to the other panelists because I work with media companies rather than in media companies. So as a small organization, we're a consultancy and agency that only work with news and media. The very first thing that I ask is, how do we pay for it? Because that's really important for me, and it takes a lot of spreadsheets and kind of scenario testing to work out if we're going to do something. And we decided early on that in order to innovate in the news industry, we needed to innovate ourselves. And so we actually just launched something that I spoke about the other day, and we're creating a kind of automatic tool for video creation. We self-funded that to begin with. We got that to a certain point, and then we were able to use that as a proof of concept to get a grant, and then our strategy was to use that grant to get to the point where we could have paying newsrooms pay for it. And that was a process that we really had to map out. And it's quite stressful, and we spend a long time doing projections whether we can afford to do this. The next thing that we think about in terms of innovation is, can we do this ourselves, or do we need to bring in resource? And I'm aware that when we're innovating, we need to think about whether we're going to bring in people, but also as an organization that gets brought in to other organizations, what is the reason why we might be requested to come in and support that? And so we think about what our capacity is. Do we have the skills and experience? Should we spend on the experience because we don't have that ourselves? And then there's more practical things like, if we keep it in-house, then we are more sure about the IP implications. If we create something and it's done by our employees, then that's going to be safer down the line and ultimately serve our clients better. So that's the kind of second consideration. The third consideration we have for innovation is, are we better off doing this collaboratively? And there are two main advantages to that. You spread the cost, going back to the first thing, which is really important to us, but also you get multi-stakeholder buy-in. So people feel an ownership of it, and you've got more people wanting it to succeed. And that really helps. So a few years ago, I launched an initiative called Pop-Up Newsroom, and our motto for that was innovation through collaboration. That collaborative process allowed us to push things forward so much faster because we had so many inputs and so many people wanting it to succeed that it was a really great model, and we got to do brand new things that no one had done before. And then the fourth thing is, am I confident enough to stick my neck out with this innovation? So I guess that's the glitter pony thing for me. I know that I've done my research, I've spent a lot of time doing spreadsheets, I've paid experts to do some due diligence research on something that I think we should be doing. At what point do I make that decision, even if I'm the first one to do it? And yesterday I was talking about our direct publishing work. No one else is doing that, but the spreadsheets told us that we should invest in doing that to try and just kickstart that innovation. So it's 4 questions for us around innovation.
And I would say an excellent bridge to Justyna, because you've collaborated and you're currently collaborating on some innovative projects with multiple stakeholders. I would say a lot of public broadcasters. How do you get them to invest in those kind of projects?
Thank you, Ezra. First, I would like to start by saying that when I met you many years ago, you were the head of the lab at the News Lab at VRT. And I was thinking this morning, we all have HR units in our companies. And I think that we are at the stage of development where there shouldn't be a company which doesn't have a lab. Because how are you to survive in the changing world if you don't have that place that is thinking? It doesn't mean that it's limited only, to this place. And one of the things we also discussed back when we were working together was like, how do we convince others? And I think we will be doing this. But I was thinking that in a way, you can make a reference to the motivations that we have. And it's very easy to think about it because you can say, well, there is a pure biological survival need, and we all have this survival need. We need to survive. We need our companies to survive. So we need to innovate. That's a very basic way, sometimes maybe very crude, but we have to face it. That's the reality. Then there is a very, I would say, social part, social motivation, where you do certain things because it's easier, because they facilitate. And then you have, as Jane said, the big ideas that can, seduce and maybe change the world. And they are more kind of cognitive on a different level. And then they take much, much more effort. So this would be like a general perspective of the innovation, and of course I'm happy to go into our...
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you brought an example of a current project you're working on that might be considered already a big idea that you worked on together, something you might want to show us.
Thank you very much for letting me to tell you the story. So I'll take a few minutes to tell you the story of the innovation that we have, and I'm sure there will be elements that we will be discussing together that we faced. So this project is called the European Perspective, and basically it's a kind of a box that you can see here that shows the stories on front pages of public service media. So if you go to RAI, you will find this banner. If you go to RTE, the Irish National Public Broadcaster, and what it does, it brings stories from other public service media. And we have 11, you have logos of these public service media. What was amazing is, unlike for public service media, which is considered a bit of a sometimes Jurassic Park, slow machines, very bureaucratic, we have actually had an idea and we built this thing in 5 months. And I was really scared. We were supposed to launch on the 1st of July, and you know what? Everybody was ready the day before, which was really, really amazing for us. And I think the second thing was the fact that we did it all remotely. When we started the project, it was the outset of COVID when we started talking about it. So we had a first hybrid meeting, and then we finished 2 years later with the first in-person hybrid meeting last week in Brussels. So this was really pretty amazing that we've managed to somehow create something. But we also had a very good context, and I think this was one of the successes, because when we were floating these ideas 5 years ago among editors-in-chief, they were like so focused on the national agenda that there was, why do you want to put a story from Swedish radio on my France Info website? Or we still haven't managed to convince BBC, maybe one day, but it was like, no. But of course, COVID made it different, and everything that happened after COVID, and especially now, all the stories that are happening around make the case for sharing news between media organizations and definitely between public service media. So very quickly, how does it work? So here you have an example. We have stories, online stories integrated. This is an online stories exchange. This is a story from the Swedish radio, from the local station. And we decided, their editor recommended this story. This was a story about test drones delivering COVID-19 kit tests in the rural north of Sweden. And this story landed on the France Info main website. How it works, we work with AI, so it means that all the stories which come in different languages are translated automatically into English, but of course AI is not perfect. And we discovered, for example, that when we launched the European recommendation box or the European perspective, we discovered on one of our members, I won't tell which one, a first big fault which said naked Merkel, so they quickly corrected this. So therefore, in our workflow, we still have human who has to verify that that the translation is editorially correct. So you have Swedish radio English version that is verified by a human, and then it's translated normally by a human into language of the destination country. You can read it in French on France Info, but you can of course also go to the original website if you are a Swedish speaker in France. So, great idea, isn't it? We've managed to gather all these people who created and worked with us. We have managed to convince quite a lot of top management in our companies, but when it comes to the newsroom, this is what it is. It's very, very hard, because these people, in most cases, are making it on top of their own other tasks, and they are extremely busy with COVID, with the war in Ukraine, and hopefully we'll talk about it a little bit more. Well, you just have to share it, you have to educate. We rely on our members educating and spreading the news, and probably the easiest way is sometimes very simple, very personal. So this is an example, you might not see it, but this is an email from a colleague from the Swiss Info who says to his colleague, well, listen, your story, Swiss Info publishes in 9 languages their online news, and he says your story has been picked up by several public service media and is now displayed on other front pages. So that was pretty good. Okay, so we had all this, period when we created, we came from the idea, but then, of course, the question is, so what are audiences thinking about it? And we are still in the process of doing audience research, but when we got some feedback from YLE, that was something that we kind of really, we could have dreamt about. And I think that later we heard a bit more. We also did a focus group with the Cardiff University, and it was pretty much the same. I only chose two. There was, of course, some criticism as well, so not everything was positive. But I think this was the essence of the value, is that it's actually really cool to see stories from Europe with local flavor, and maybe not just international news full of also news from US or general global news. And I'm almost finishing there. So I think the project is about the flavors, the different stories. And there is so much we have to share. You see the champagne, you see the Guinness. We all know it's not the time, to drink Guinness or to champagne. The stories that are happening around us are very sad. And sometimes when you do innovation, you get tired. We go through hundreds of bureaucratic processes, convincing people, helping our members, convincing their countries. But sometimes you have these moments which are really, really powerful and emotional. And I had one 2 days ago. We went to Rai, the public broadcaster in Italy. We're trying to make sure and convince them that they stay in the next phase of the project, which will continue with additional EU funding. And I spoke to the lady, Laura Aprati. You can see her here at the bottom with a colleague, where you see two faces. This is the older lady. And she says, Justyna, I was just producing a story. She works for the Rai Newsroom. Online is almost over 40 people. And she says, I've just been producing a story about Sarajevo. I was a reporter in Sarajevo and other war zones. And she says, I'm going to fight for this project because we cannot lose democracy. And people and citizens in Europe have to understand one another. And I believe that this really helps it. And we are in this moment in time. And this was this was something that gave me an extra power, to think about, again, the seductive, the cognitive aspect of this project. And to know that all these people, as I said, that we finally met after 2 years in Brussels, believe in this project is something that gives energy. And it's really nice to be all together and feel the energy together again.
Thank you. And it's interesting how many aspects of the puzzle that we wanted to put together today are mentioned. It's believing in that idea and doing that collectively. Certainly, if you want to collaborate with a lot of different companies, doing that in a very difficult period of the pandemic, hybrid, and finding new ways to work that together. But then at the end, also delivering value and feeling that you achieved something together. So thank you for sharing it. I want to ask you to also bring the last slide on the screen, because what I forgot to mention is you can ask questions, but the easy thing to do is if you use slido.com and there's this hashtag 089680, and then I'll see questions popping up here, and then I'll use them later for the panel. I quickly wanted to pick one idea out of what you told, was like how difficult it sometimes is to bring innovation in the newsroom, because the day-to-day is so much pressuring onto them, and most of the times they also feel like these are not our ideas. You came with an idea and then you try to sell it to us, and it's certainly something that currently at Mediahuis. It was also a realization. We have an innovation manager, and most of the time he has funding opportunities like Horizon 2020 programs, or Google comes with innovation funding, and then we have to find some sponsor in the newsroom that really wants to collaborate on that. And we start to define new ways to empower the newsroom themselves to come with ideas. So we're currently setting up and trying to set up a Mediahuis innovation fund that's really there for the newsroom. So we define challenges that are strategically important for us, like how might we deliver new ways of storytelling that really meet user needs, but we want the newsrooms to think about it and come up with ideas. And we hope that that will spur innovation bottom up rather than top down or from the outside. So I don't know if you can relate to that and how you work and bring in innovation in the newsroom. Maybe Jane?
Yeah, thank you. It's a really, really good point, and I think we all everyone in this room who works in a newsroom, I'm sure, has absolutely no flex, right? We're all working at 110% all the time, and it's pretty exhausting. But I think there are a couple of things. If we go back to my second bucket, as I was talking about what we do and how we do it, one of the things that I find is really useful is to tap into the exhaustion and to the slightly negative feelings, and then really engage people on how can we make this better. So I had a brilliant colleague in a job about 10 years ago now called Mark, and he would come to me with so many complaints, and I'd look up at him with a sort of expectant look. He said, "Oh, I know, bring me a solution, don't bring me a problem." And that was kind of our constant sort of conversation. It was like, okay, we know that this is a problem, so how can we solve it together? And I think by engaging people, by hearing their problems and really appreciating them. I mean, like most people just don't complain just for the sake of it. There are things to complain about in a newsroom. But really engaging them on the problem and then engaging them on the solution, I think is a really, really helpful thing. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one issue is around tools. So many people are complaining about, the spread of email, and you had to be in on all these emails, otherwise you wouldn't know. And what could we bring in? Could we bring in Slack? But Thomson Reuters wasn't happy with the security on Slack. We then actually worked with Microsoft to improve Teams to be able to do the things that we wanted to be able to do in our newsroom. And with all the collaboration tools, none of them is perfect yet. But it was actually really interesting because you actually harnessed some energy, even if it was negative energy, we harnessed that energy in the newsroom, and then we were able to use that to find a solution both in-house, but then also with an external provider as big as Microsoft. And they were delighted to have sort of frustrated users really help them to shape something. So it was something that came up grassroots and ended up going up to one of the biggest companies in the world. And then the second example I would give is that during the pandemic, particularly after the death of George Floyd, there was a lot of frustration in the newsroom about our sourcing. And I was kind of aware of it, but it really bubbled up. It was like somebody was just turning up the heat under this frustration. And so again, going back to okay, so how are we going to solve this together? It became that actually there was this grassroots movement of about a dozen people who really, really want to work on looking at how we're sourcing, whose stories are we telling, whose perspectives are we giving on a big story, how are we doing that? What I love about it is that it's something that the management really feels strongly about, but we'd done a couple of things that were top down and they were kind of getting stuck. But when it comes grassroots up, it actually has more power, like it shifts the inertia of a newsroom. And what I found with that is that it's great to have the passion in the newsroom. It's brilliant. I love being a journalist because we're all so passionate. But it's great to have the passion of the newsroom. But what I find is that the passion goes nowhere unless you can give it a process and then you can give it a push. So like all of this passion about sourcing, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. But well, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to measure it? What are we going to look at? We can't look at the entire file. We write the equivalent of a Bible every day. Like, how are we going to cut it up? And by helping people to think about the how we're going to do this, they then learn some innovation tools and techniques that, like Fergus has been speaking about, and I'm sure will give us some more tips. But you're passing on those skills. You're building that capability of thinking. But again, people are busy, so they're very excited about it, and then it sort of starts to drift down. And so then you have to give it a push. So you take their passion, you give them a process, and then you keep on pushing.
So how do you capture that? Like when is a problem or a need big enough for you to start thinking about new solutions? That's a really good idea. I mean, gosh, if you took everybody's ideas that came up, you'd just be spinning around in circles every day. I think it's about sort of, if there's a match between what's coming up from the grassroots and something that we can see from the sort of the editorial leadership position, if there's a match, then that's usually a really good sign. That's probably a green light for it. And if we believe that it's important for our audiences and our clients. So you want to make sure that it's fitting, like there's a passion in the newsroom, there's a need in the newsroom. We see that, yes, it's something that we should spend some time doing, and it's going to have an impact for our clients and our audience. Yeah. There are lots of other ideas that are not so big, and frankly, it's like, great, yeah, get on with it. And then if they get on with it, they do, and if they don't, then they don't. But we're not going to sort of put that energy and the management time and effort in. Yeah.
But I think if there's that match of those three pieces, then it gets some attention.
Fergus, how do you bridge that? Because I imagine it's not the newsroom knocking on your door. It's always like a senior manager or an executive who might knock on your door and say, like, hey, we have a problem here. Can you help us? How do you make sure that then ends up and lands in the newsroom and is accepted there?
So it's very frustrating being on these panels when you agree with everyone. I agree with everything that Jane just said. I was trying to find something
I'll come with some
to disagree with. So I think it's about, some people are worried about innovation work, or they don't, and our experience working with newsrooms is they definitely don't want to do something that is completely open-ended. They need to see the end. And I think that's the same for staff and the people that are involved in it. So as Jane mentioned process, I'd also written down that we have to agree the structures and process for innovation up front, and that means talking to the executives, but it also means having the more junior people in the room, the practitioners in the room, and telling them, this is the process that we're going to go through, this is why we're doing it, and they will be bought into it, hopefully, because they will have had something to say. And then we get to this point where you start to build something that you should rather than something that you want. And so one of the structures and processes that we do with anyone that we're working with, whether they're a client or a collaborator, is we get everyone in the room to think about their stakeholders. And we use this kind of adapted version of design thinking to map out all of the stakeholders that they want to work for. And 9 out of 10 times, maybe 10 out of 10 times, they will forget the audience as one of their stakeholders. And it's fascinating. We can kind of prepare sessions around the fact that they're going to forget it. And as soon as we start to talk about the audience as a stakeholder, and then we talk about the things that are possible, we're able to link back to the person who needs this. So wow, this is a great idea, and I'm sure you really want to do that, but how does it serve that audience member that you identified before? And there's no resentment then if someone comes up with an idea that sounds amazing, but actually there's no use case for it. And so, but you can only really get that trust from the people involved if you set out the process in advance, and they can therefore have a little bit of patience with you because they know where you're going with this and the point you're going to get to. And also don't make these sessions really long, like 90 minutes and then at a time max.
Yeah. And how has this changed during the pandemic and maybe after? Because I guess you couldn't enter newsrooms anymore. You couldn't physically kind of convince people in a room. Certainly, I guess from your perspective, that's not making it easier.
So we started Fathom in November 2019, and we really only got going just as the pandemic hit. And I think we used to pride ourselves on being kind of energetic and facilitating really nice projects in the room. We try to translate that to a digital space. We use Miro a lot for that work. It's a bit awkward because someone that I'm going to use an example, I know they're in the room now, is that one thing we do, instead of running a day-long event with someone, we set up a Miro board, we start populating it, and then our collaborators, we say, okay, we've built the board, we've got the parameters, fill it in your own time, and we can come back later on and see where you are. Like, you can just keep coming back.
Kind of asynchronous.
Yeah, and we explain the process again, and it just gives people that breathing space.
Yeah, just I guess the same question for you. How do you keep momentum when you don't have like physical meetings and you have these hybrid things that kind of flow in and flow out?
I think that what Fergus said was key. It's building the trust. And as I said, honestly, we had only one hybrid meeting in March 2020, and then we had first proper in-person meeting in 2022 March. So everything was online. It was much harder to build trust between all the people, and of course the collaboration was different because we were talking about different newsrooms and different needs and different speeds in digital innovation and different amounts of funding. But again, I think what was very important and what Jane also said is really talking and understanding people. So there was much more talking, a lot of individual conversations, apart from the group conversations or smaller conversations. And it takes longer, but it's possible to build the trust even in a, you know, in an online environment. But yeah, I think it's much faster and much more productive to innovate when you can see with people face into face. That is for sure.
I totally agree. I wish it wasn't. I wish that we had managed to crack sort of, you know, virtual collaboration. One of the things that I found, and just in case it's a useful tip, is when we are doing virtual collaboration, which we still actually have to do and kind of always did at Reuters because we've got people all over the world. So it's a very great privilege actually to have everybody in the same room, and you often get the best diversity of ideas if you don't. But one of the things that I learned, which was a real challenge for me, to be honest with you, is to be very comfortable with silence in a virtual room. And I found that really hard because I think, you know, when things go quiet on a Teams meeting or a Zoom meeting, my natural inclination is to think that I've frozen or that people can't hear me or that somebody's muted or something. And actually what I found, so we did quite a big brainstorm around a really tricky, kind of a wicked problem that we have with our text file. And we got together lots of great brains from the tech team, from the product team, from editors, from reporters, and we had, yeah, the team was from everything from New York, Toronto, London, Bangalore, you know, a really big mixture of people. And you know, just putting this in my mind from what Fergus was saying about having a Miro board up. And actually, it was so helpful just to say, right, we just, you know, no one has to speak. Like for the next 10, 15 minutes, just think. Like we're all on, but you know, can turn your cameras off, but just think and put some stuff on the Miro board. And then what it allowed was for more of the quiet people, actually, to get a say. I was having a couple of little side chats with the people that I knew were more junior and probably weren't going to say anything. And it was so uncomfortable. And it was like the longest 10, 15 minutes, you know, of my team's existence. But actually, it was really important to, when you're face to face, you can look at each other, you can read each other's body language, you can vibe. And actually, it was turning that entirely on its head and saying everyone's at home by themselves. They can't lean in, so actually give them time to lean back.
What I also think is a very useful tip from Fergus is not to try to squeeze everything in the meetings themselves, because you have these innovation frameworks and you want to do step by step, but if you constrain it in a kind of Teams meeting, then suddenly you don't have the space to say, oh, let's take a bit more time here. And you feel very constrained by the 1 hour window that you have agreed on, or the 2 hour window. While if you say, just take some time and let's come back on that, and space that a bit more out like you would normally do in a physical meeting, I feel that's also very important. Are there any other things that you would take away or take to the future of innovation in your newsroom from that pandemic period?
Can I just say one thing on the kind of virtual meetings? And I think one of the actual positive things around the virtual innovation kind of meetings or workshops is we can do breakouts. And so you can, when you would be in a normal room and you might, you know, get people to go into a different corner or something, actually breakout rooms are really handy for innovation. And we often give the same task to different rooms, and they independently will go off in a completely different direction, and then we can all quickly come back. No one's going to go to the toilet and, you know, get a cup of tea or check their emails or go for another meeting. We bring everyone back from the breakout rooms, and we can just quickly debrief and pick out of 4 ideas from the same brief. And I think that's been a really nice experience that we would certainly take forward. Even
So would you would keep that kind of?
I'd like to
part
work
of your
out how
process.
to build that into the physical spaces again, so that we can, because that was just really positive, and it gives that opportunity for people who are quieter to speak in smaller rooms, and they're not feeling like they have to speak up in front of everyone, and actually it feels a little bit more equal and democratic.
I think just the one other thing I would take away from the pandemic is a sense of urgency. We kind of went into like emergency situation. It's like, oh my God, you know, and I found that internally, but actually also externally from our clients. like newsrooms all around the world were going into an emergency situation, and it was really interesting that really big clients of ours, big broadcasters particularly, who had been thoroughly reliant on Reuters content coming into their internal systems. So they suddenly couldn't use their internal systems because they were very heavy, they were on desktop, suddenly everyone was at home and everything. And we had been pushing for a few years, like maybe 2-3 years, Reuters Connect, which is the web platform where you can come in and find all of our content. Sorry, this isn't a sales push, but it's just an interesting story. But we've been trying to get people to sign up. There's no extra cost. You're already a client. Like, you can have as many logons as you want. But lots of the big broadcasters had really just like, no, that's going to be too confusing for people, la la la. And then all of a sudden, like in Britain, March the 24th, the phone starts going, like, what do we do? Everyone's at home. And so actually there was a sense of urgency coming at us from outside. And luckily, we were well placed to go, we have a solution, here you go, like, sign up here, you're sorted out in 15 minutes, we've got you done. But I think that sense of urgency and that, I hope we don't go back into an emergency situation, but I think very often innovation gets put on the important pile and not on the urgent pile. And then suddenly it becomes urgent, and if you haven't done all the work that we're talking about, it's very hard to spin it up. I mean, the fact that Justyna managed to pull that up together in 5 months is astounding. But like, that sense of we've got to do it. This is an important thing. Like, democracy is an important thing, but actually, at what point does it become an urgent thing?
I find that a fascinating word, urgent, because it's also the word that you hear most in newsrooms. Like, innovation has to wait because there's something urgent happening now. So you might want to replace that. Well, actually, innovation is also urgent. But coming back to some of the challenges that are ahead, and it's certainly, as we can all feel it, budgets will be under pressure coming up. And then I guess you will again have that narrative of, we'll first have to fix the business of today rather than trying to innovate for tomorrow. How do you see your organization tackle that?
I wanted also to go back a little bit, step back to what you said, Ezra, is the pandemic period and what does it mean for us now. And I wanted to say that we also had an amazing experience because we had calls, every 2 weeks we had calls with editors-in-chief to see how they are dealing in their newsrooms. I mean, we have a newsroom in Geneva, we created parallel newsrooms, we had a core team working in the newsroom, and the rest of the people were working remotely. There were newsrooms which were able to work entirely remotely. There were newsrooms who were working, who closed themselves, for example, and had 2-week shifts, like I think it was ORF in Austria. So everybody was doing things differently. And it was just really fascinating. There was no one recipe. It depended on the systems you had. It depended on the culture, on the gravity of the situation. What was amazing is that the innovation and learning the digital tools and coming up with so many solutions in such an amazing short time, this I think is something which benefits us today, and it will help, I think, to face challenges and accelerate. And we don't need to explain to people anymore, this is the change, we need to do it. But I think what is important is that, and I'm sure you feel the same, everybody is exhausted. And everybody has been exhausted from COVID, and now we have the war in Ukraine, and you talked about the budget. The budgets are stretched. This puts extra budget stretch. And I think that that's why for us, who have the title, who have innovation in the title, that is very difficult. Because as you say, the people are very, very tired. And I think that we have to now be very careful how we balance it. We are tired as well, because we are all learning. We have extra platforms, Telegram, Signals, Teams, WhatsApps. And we're learning how different people are responding. And I think personally that one of the biggest priorities now for us, apart from innovation, is to take a step back. How do you find place for reflection? How do you evaluate if your team has energy to breathe and innovate? Because otherwise they won't be able to accept. They went through such a energy, and speed of innovation. They're under news pressure now. So how do we disconnect to connect and be able to innovate? I think that that's the biggest challenge that
So
is facing
taking a step back to look at what we've done the last 2 years and maybe reflect on that and jump to the next one. On the budget, Fergus, I'm also curious if you have some ideas where we might get some extra fund for innovation.
So firstly, innovation doesn't always require money to do. You can make changes, and you can, another exercise that we do with people is we get them to list all of the resources that they've already got, the people that they've got, and how can we deliver this innovation with what we've already got and with the capacity that we've got. So that person might even just have an hour a week to just work on this. Well, what can we do with that? I also think it's important to spot a moment of innovation. So we've been doing some work with fact checkers and the WHO in Africa, and to create highly visual content to counter vaccine and COVID misinformation on social platforms. We started this work and we designed it, and all of a sudden we realized that it was pretty successful. And with a team of 2 people, we reached 150 million people with this content. A little bit of boosting there, but like we reached a lot of people. And we continued doing it, and we worked with some other people, and this content has now reached 350 million people. And so we thought, we're doing something right here. Perhaps this is the area where we should be exploring some more innovation. And then we applied for a really small government grant in the UK that would just allow us to do the next part of that, just the bit that we couldn't self-fund. And that's how we keep going. But it wasn't a whiteboarded moment, it was a serendipitous.
Yeah, and smaller experiments and learning from that and then growing from there.
Yeah.
Is that something you recognize, or has Reuters like a big chunk of, or a big pile of money for innovation?
Oh, I wish. I keep on putting my hand down the sofa, hoping that I'm going to find $1 billion, you know. I think one of the issues is budget. But I mean, when I think about resources for any project, I think of 4 resources. So people, time, technology, and money. And any 4 of those, you can be in scarcity. Money always is the one that gets put to you first, but quite quickly you find out, we talked about people in time earlier on, and then technology can also be a real not necessarily a blocker, but something that's going to hold you back. And so I think, I think where we are now, and it fits in with what Justyna was saying about the exhaustion, is that there's so much still to be done. Like, we've done so much, and therefore, the more you do, the more you see that you've got to do. And also, the more you've done, the more you're excited to do the next lot. But at the same time, in a big company like ours, there's now quite a backlog of stuff. The war in Ukraine has not helped us. We had a very big tech team in Ukraine and Russia. So what do you do there? How are we going to prioritize of all the things that we have on the wish list? How are we going to prioritize what's going to be the most impactful? And it might not be the glitter pony, it might be something, which is actually about plumbing. We launched a whole new architecture for our website last year, and it was a good year in the making. And people just think, well, I can put something on WordPress immediately. Like, why is it taking so long? Why are you being so slow? But in a big company...
Sorry, I recognize it, sorry.
But it was about totally and utterly rebuilding the architecture of the website, which most journalists don't give 2 hoots about. Like, what do you mean the architecture? What do you mean SEO architecture? What do you mean? Well, now they love it because they're getting so much more traffic from having good SEO. But, there's a lot of background product work that needs to be done. And there's a lot of frustration, I think, that, product and tech have to move along roadmaps, and they have lots of contingencies, and you do project management, and journalists come in, and I've got a fantastic idea, let's do it yesterday. So I think that's kind of one of the issues now, is like the resource crunch, the massive backlog, resource crunch across those 4 pieces, and yet lots and lots of ideas and the desire to get stuff done. So I think that's where we risk now sort of running into sort of boggy water.
Yeah, Fergus, go ahead. And then I want to go to a few questions that came in.
I wanted to ask Jane a question. When you have that backlog, do you have a clear process for the prioritization, and how do you communicate that so that people aren't kind of put off by the delay?
It's a really good question. I think it's something that we need to be working on a lot more. I think a lot of the unsexy innovation, a lot of the unsexy work, doesn't necessarily have to be innovation. It can actually just be, sort of clearing things up, can take a long, long time. And inevitably there are conflicting priorities, not just between product and editorial and sales and tech, but also between, for us, our financial B2B work, our agency work, our direct-to-consumer or direct-to-professional work. There are so many conflicting priorities, and I think actually it's a very good question, and I think our mark on that's probably lower than it should be. And actually having some sort of company-wide trust and transparency to be able to say, look, that's going to have to wait because we're doing this. And if there's a groundswell then of opinion that no, we need to do B rather than A, then we can revalue that and look at it. But I think communication is such a critical piece of innovation. And I think the bigger and more complex the organization and the stakeholders are, the more important it is and the more difficult it gets.
Yeah, and from my experience, certainly in certain product areas, there was always crunching points where everything comes together. So you will need to prioritize. You cannot just say, oh, let's do that separately or in different corners. No, it comes together because it needs to land in the product, or it needs to land in the CMS, or it needs to land somewhere else. I see some questions coming in, and I'll pick them here. One of them is, what are the big levers organizations need to pull to provide innovation projects the best chances of success? I don't know who of the three wants to answer that first.
We feel like the dragons. We don't know what the projects are about, so we can't really choose or judge. But I think that it will depend on the priorities in the organization, on how on the complexity or the need for the project. But it's really hard to answer. As long as the simplest way is to see, you have to show, especially if you're trying to pitch the project, is what problem you are solving and how quickly and easy you can solve that problem, because each organization in Newsroom has a problem, and if you can show that and demonstrate that, then of course people want their problems to be solved. So maybe that's the easiest answer.
My answer is, how are you going to pay for it?
But I think it's a very good question, because I think the levers that you pull are kind of critical to get it happening. And I think, in classic sort of innovation, not necessarily in media but elsewhere, people will talk about buy, build, or partner. So are you going to buy in expertise? You're going to partner with somebody else, or are you actually going to build it yourself? And I think that's kind of one of the first critical questions before you then decide what levers you're going to need. But I definitely think, sorry to be thoroughly agreeing with the other panelists, we should have more of a debate, but like having that idea of like, what problem are we trying to solve, I think is really critical. Or that's kind of like a deficiency gap, like what is going wrong that we want to make go right. I think then there's also a point that hopefully we'll get to again soon, where there's an aspiration gap. Where do we want to be in 3 to 5 years' time, and how do we get there? Because that's that's the smiley face innovation. And it doesn't have to be glitter pony, but it can be that sort of aspirational hope that drives things. But you do need to go back to those 4 things that I put as the resources.
How do you tackle resistance against innovation in the newsroom? Like, you better stay out. We don't need innovation here. We want to focus on the news of today. How do you tackle that? I don't know if there's anybody with experience here.
Sorry if I'm talking quite a lot, but so I learned a brilliant tool for this when I was doing what was the Salzburger courses, now the Media Transformation Challenge. And it's a really simple 4-way matrix, a 4-box matrix of power and opinion. So who has power over what you're going to do, and what's their opinion? And so very often you might get the grumblers, but if they're not actually going to have any influence over the innovation product, then you can just ignore them. You know, like they're just noise, they're just annoying. So you kind of have to put your fingers in your ears and ignore them. If they're low power and they're low opinion, if they're high power and high opinion, brilliant, they're your influencers, they're your go-to people, they're the guys who are going to keep running, and you just want to empower them as much as possible, give them a bit of guidance and let them run, because it's much better for them to be running it than you. If they're high power but low opinion, I also tend to ignore them for a while. I kind of let's get ourselves going. And if they're high opinion and low power, then they're my allies. So like it might be like the editor-in-chief is really pro this. She has no power over how it happens, but she's really pro it. And if she mentions it in a couple of public meetings, then those people who are high power, low opinion will eventually realize that this is good for them to get on board. So I literally map people out and then work out, okay, who do I need? Who can help me get this thing done?
Yeah, it's a bit the idea of the coalition of the willing, and then also seeing who can actually influence.
I just add that, so I'm on the other side, which is going into newsrooms and dealing with people like Justyna and Jane, who may be thinking about doing something and doing the buying in. For us, go back to that point I made at the beginning, it has to be a finishable experience. That person, if they're taking something on, they have to know what the deliverable is and what the end is, and it can't just be open-ended engagement. So when we work with people, we say, we're going to do this, it will be this long, the engagement, and this will be the deliverable at the end of it. And that deliverable is something that you can use. If you want to do the next part of it, you'll have the tools to do that yourself, or we can help you if you had a good experience. But regardless, that first engagement is going to get you to the first step. And if someone doesn't want that, then they don't want it, and you can't push it because you're never going to succeed either. But just making sure that someone can always see the end, because I think otherwise they feel like they can spend so much money on something.
I think going back to what Jane said, you could also say that, identify or map the people and really kind of forget about the unable and unwilling. But if you are able to convince the able and unwilling, he can or she can become your biggest advocate, and that person can change a lot. Even more than the person who is able and willing, because they are up always for something. But if you can convince that person, then I think you can, convince the rest.
Is there like a secret message or storytelling that you can do for the gatekeepers, really, the people that can say yes or no to innovation? Like, in terms of how to convince those that really matter, the ones in power, the ones in influence that can make or break innovation? Is there like a secret message, a formula?
I don't know, it's a secret message. I think it's just communication, and understand who you're talking to. Understand what's going to get their heart beating. My editor-in-chief is such a big ideas person. So if I can sell her on the big idea, then she'll get excited about it and she'll just go, that sounds great. And then she'll be on to the next thing. Whereas my former editor-in-chief wanted to understand all of the details. And so I had to go to him with like a really solid project plan before he got excited about it. So I think that's my, not so secret, but I mean, I think it's relatively sort of common sense, but that's what I found when I don't do that, when I don't speak the language of the person who's receiving the message, is when I fall over flat on my face, or at least trip myself up.
I had an interesting one, and I think we're running close to the end, but if Fergus has an innovation product and he wants to get it to Reuters to say yes, what does he need to do? Same for Justyna. So, Fergus, we're pitching an idea that to both EBU and Reuters.
You're asking my secrets now. I'd probably take them for a drink after sharing a panel with them.
I'm looking forward to it. Get the ice cream.
Yeah. Whatever you want.
But also the other way around, I guess for Reuters or EBU to say yes to an innovation idea that comes from the outside, what are the criteria you look into?
I would say it's the same as an internal innovation idea. Like, does it match something that we really want to do? Does it fit with our serving of our clients and our audiences? And is it something that's going to make a difference to the way that we work in the newsroom? I've been involved in some really brilliant sort of out there sort of conceptual innovation, which is going to be years in coming. So I was involved in the Journalism AI project in its first year. I mean, if you haven't had a chance to go and to some of their sessions. I think there are another couple, but I really recommend it because it's great just to sort of like stretch your brain out into the future. And you know, we're so involved in the day-to-day, we don't think about those things that are sort of 3, 5, 10 years out. And, you know, yeah, I kind of read things about Web3 and I'm like, wow, metaverse, wow, you know, but it's good for me to stretch my brain there. But if someone comes and pitches me an idea about the metaverse right now, I've just got enough fires to put out already. You know what I mean? I mean, I'd love to have the conversation, but it's not going to I'm not going to pay money for somebody to come in and do that. So it's finding it's finding the sweet spot on that you can't do it yourself, but it's relevant to you. And it's not too far off in the future. So it's like finding that sweet spot along the curve.
And sometimes you have to be, you know, provocative as well. And as you say, you know, use your whatever arguments. Recently, talking to my bosses that I know are future thinking, but at the same time so focused these days on running the factory and the realities, right, that we all facing, which are not easy. And I said, well, in the end, you know, trying to convince them to some kind of innovation and ideas, I said, well, I would like to, and I'm sure that we would like to be all working for a, you know, for a factory that is producing green cars and not finish with the line of hybrid cars. I want to be in a factory that produces green cars. So sometimes you have to, I mean, there's different ways to communicate or carry the need.
I think we're close to the end, but I want to end with one final question. If there's people in the room that want to start with innovation within their organization and there's not yet a formal structure, how do you start?
So I would say that you need to frame your innovation in something that's possible. And I think that there are a lot of people in the journalism world who talk about innovation, but their organizations may be nothing like yours. Their situation may be nothing like yours. So I would look around and see who is innovating and doing things that you know can be done, and then work out how you might be able to do that in your situation. An example I would give, and may get booed off the stage here, is but a lot of conference time elsewhere is devoted to non-profit formats. That works very well in the US. You try to replicate it somewhere else. It doesn't work very well, but it's touted as one of the most aspirational things that an organization might be able to do. That you should look at what is possible within your own ecosystem or your own region, and know that it might be possible before you start looking at it, or that the conditions are right for it to succeed.
Any last words, Jane?
I think I'll try to be a bit provocative for the end so that we can have good conversations over ice cream. I have used innovation in my title in the past. I explain my role as being head of editorial innovation, and they're like, I sometimes wonder if it's too scary a word for some people. I think when people think about innovation, it's like, oh God, you know, what is she going to throw at us this time? Like, oh, what's she going to ask of us this time? You know, why do we have to do something new all the time? And actually, so my question to you, and you can answer me after, what's another word that we could use instead of innovation? Because I do think that people their minds always go to the glitter pony, and they always think it's something really big and it's really scary and it's going to take up so many resources, rather than thinking, brilliant, this is something that can help me. And so I think maybe my last thought is, do we need to come up with a different framing for innovation in newsrooms?
That's a good question for over ice cream. We got the 5-minute sign, but we started 5 minutes early, so I want to thank the panel for the good talk and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ezra.